Davide Uskava, fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton.
Slánseán. Good day, whiskey brothers, sisters, friends. Welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's fourth book of season 6 with Justine Hazlehurst, author of this one right here, Opening the Case, Affairs of the Pattisons Whiskies. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us today as well. And really, where else would you rather be where we could delve so deeply into the subject of whiskey with the author than right here. My name is Dolph. I'm the Spirit of Edmonton on social media platforms, founder of the Whiskey Book Club, and your host this morning and this early evening for our friends in the British Isles. And for those of you that are a little bit new to the Whiskey Book Club, we are a safe place. We're a home base for whiskey geeks that love to share a dram and share a passion for reading, mostly about whiskey or whiskey-related activities. Now, here, I got to get the book out again, so I got to drop one of them. So right here, this book is the 31st book reviewed, and it's Justine's inaugural book. So Justine's very active in the whiskey scene, and she's an active vlogger, blogger, organizer, and Instagram poster. A little alliteration for y'all this morning. She is the co-director of the Fife and Borderlands Whiskey Festivals, as well as active judge with the Scottish Whiskey, World Whiskey, Spirit of Speyside, and Icons of Whiskey Awards. So very active. Justine has researched and written several articles on the history of a number of distilleries. She's the creator of the Leith Whisky Trail, which we started talking about before we came on, and which I need to go on this summer. And she is here today speaking to us about her first of, I hope, many books. Whew. So that's a lot to say. And a lot of knowledge right there. But let's welcome Justine. How are you this morning? And what do you have in your glass this early evening?
Yeah, all good. Evening here in Scotland, so it's about 6 o'clock. So I have a whiskey that I used at one of the tastings recently. So this is an old 80s bottling. It's called Round Table Reserve. And it was bottled by J&G Grant. You can just see at the bottom there. I believe this is Glenfarclas, so bottled under a different name, but this is a Glenfarclas. So it kind of links with what we're going to talk about.
We do. I have some Glenfarclases behind me up there and some that I didn't want to take out on the side. And an SMWS Glenfarclas that that's up there as well. So the 1210 that I think you guys had as well, but came to Canada. We have mutual friends from the SMWS. They're owners of what's the name of that distillery? They're owners of Hollywood Distillery. Thank you. So, yeah, and they got me that bottle, which was great because, yeah, it's nice to have friends that are just willing to bring stuff back for you when they're overseas. So, Kelly and Rob, thank you very much. I'll give you a shout out for that. And let's get right into this. I mentioned quite a few things about you. So vlogger, blogger, all-around whiskey lover, whiskey festival organizer, all these. Could you please tell us a little bit of personal information about your background, education, jobs, pastimes that brought you to this point in whiskey?
Okay, I'm probably not so much a blogger, actually. I'll say that. When I started Cask Whisky, maybe 2015, I took some advice. It was set up as a business, and I was told, basically, add a blog to your website. It helps with Google rankings. So I started a blog. Probably not that good at blogging these days. I don't do as much as perhaps I would like. But yeah, a few videos on YouTube and all of the other things. Yeah,
Instagram definitely. And that. Yeah, you're there.
Things. Yeah, I was a secondary school teacher for about the best part of 20 years. I used to teach French. In the last 10 years of my career, I was teaching French in Fife, which is where the link with Fife comes in. Okay. And always used to drink whiskey when I went out. Probably in the 20s, it was always blended whiskey, usually with Coke or something like that. But I'm actually quite a short person, you see. So I think that's because I'm so short. I like beer and I like wine, but I can't drink a lot of it just because of the sheer
Okay.
liquid. So with whiskey being short measures, I kind of like that. That was the correct volume of liquid for me. So I've always been a whiskey drinker. But yeah, it started off obviously with blends. I think a lot of people were drinking blends, and then I came to Scotland for a weekend. Came to Edinburgh for a weekend, and that was my first sort of taste of single malts. That would have been maybe 2005, 2000,
Okay.
something like that. And then I came back again for another weekend, tried some more single malts, and then eventually made the decision to move to Scotland. So I moved here in end of 2006, I think.
Okay.
So yeah,
All because of the single malts.
all
Look at
because
that. The drink.
all because of the whiskey. And yeah, and then after that, just I think as most people, they're the same as, you know, they I hate to use the word journey, but I think it's a word that people sort of use quite a lot. And then you realize it's not just the liquid, it's the people that you meet, it's the history, it's the production process, and all of this that you can really sort of geek out. And then yeah, just grew and grew and grew. And then I realized I didn't want to be a teacher anymore. And I thought, how can I make this hobby of mine tax deductible? So, so I started setting up a tastings business and some tours as well, tours around Scotland, visiting various different distilleries. And then, yeah, things just sort of grew arms and legs, really, and took me in different directions.
Did you have, I don't know, a mentor, a whiskey single malt mentor that kind of brought you into it?
Not really, no. I had friends who used to drink single malts. I mean, my dad used to drink whiskey, but as I say, it was always blends. It was always blended whiskies back in the day.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, his favorite whiskey was called Hanky Bannister. I don't know if you've heard of that in Canada.
No.
It still exists, just
Okay.
different ones these days. So it's a very good blended whiskey. And then when I moved to Leith, the flat that I bought, the apartment that I bought, was overlooking an old derelict bonded warehouse. So I started to try and do some research into that, find out who it belonged to, what was. Anyway, I found nothing out about that particular bonded warehouse, but discovered that there were about 100 others in Leith, and found out lots of information. And what was really good is that the street that my flat was on was next door to the bonded warehouse owned by the company that used to bottle Hanky Bannister, which was my dad's favorite whiskey. So it sort of went a bit full circle.
Okay. I don't know if I believe you too much about the height, because you drink SMWS, so you like your whiskey a little bit strong, like I do too. So I don't know if you can handle the 67 to 72% that we get there.
It's not so much the strength. It's like when you have a pint of beer, it's the sheer amount of liquid that you have. So at least with whiskey, you know, it's just a smallish measure, and I can cope with that. Doesn't matter much strength.
All right, I'll give that one to you. And I want to put a quote on here, if I may. So right there. So it was funny to me. I was only one sentence into the book before I was distracted by this. After setting up the Leith Whisky Trail in 2017, my interest in the Pattisons grew from genuine enthusiasm into an outright obsession, culminating in the book you have in your hands right now. So you just mentioned the Leith Whisky Trail, so I'm going to ask you for a little bit more information, because, well, I guess it's for me and my wife, because we'll be going on the Leith Whisky Trail, but it did pique my interest, and I hadn't heard of it previously. So if you could explain that for us, it'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So, it started from about 2017. I actually went down to Campbelltown, the Campbelltown Malts Festival.
Okay.
And the brilliant Kate Watt used to run a liquid history tour of Campbelltown. I think she still does, actually, but maybe not as often as she did. And she was running one for the festival. And it was a walk around Campbelltown, stopping off at where the old distilleries, the lost distilleries, were based. And then join a dram, and then it was full of like a huge amount of whiskey history. I mean, she's a font of knowledge. And so when I returned having looked into this derelict bonded warehouse, like that was opposite where I lived, finding out that there were 100 or so other bonded warehouses around Leith, I thought, I wonder if something like that would work in Leith. So I started to do a lot more research. And so the Leith Whisky Trail is essentially a walking tour around the port. It usually takes about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. It depends on how geeky folk are and how many questions they've got. And it takes as long as we need. And then after the walking tour, we finish outside what was my local pub when I lived in Leith. Okay. And then the next stage is we go into the pub and we have a tasting. And I source very old blends from, well, normally from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but it has been known 40s and 30s. Yeah, I've managed to find some of those bottles. That all of these whiskies were blended and bottled in Leith and linked to the walking tour. So if you see, for example, you can see the old bonded warehouse of MacDonald and Muir, and then we'll have like an old 70s Highland Queen as part of the tasting, which was bottled by MacDonald and Muir. So the tasting links up to the route, if you see what I mean. So depending on the bottles that I can source, depends on the route that we take. There's a lot of overlap, but it depends on the route that we take. But the beauty of this is, without realizing it, it's actually probably one of the best business plans I've ever come up with, because usually there are sort of 4 or 5 whiskies at the end, and most folk, they forget what has been said on the tour because they've had 5 drams, so they come back again and do another one. That's so I've actually had people on the tour, I think 5 times is the record so far.
Nice.
So.
Well, and if I was living there, I'm sure I'd bring friends along as well. So I'd do it for myself once a month, but I'd say I was doing it for friends afterwards. How many different spots are still? Maybe you have pictures in here, and there's a combination, something, a before and after type thing for the Whiskey Trail. Is there any of the warehouses that would still have some type of signage that might have been painted on a long time ago and still there? I wonder.
For the Pattisons, no, there isn't any signage for the Pattisons offices, but all of their offices, their warehouses, they're still there. You can see all of those. So the head office is still there, but it's now a British Heart Foundation charity shop. It's like a big furniture shop, but which is a bit ironic because it was incredibly extravagant and flamboyant. It was such a luxury building, and now it's full of like secondhand sofas, essentially. But
all right. I like the juxtaposition.
And the other warehouses, they're still all standing, and there is a huge building just along from where the Pattisons head office was, and it's often referred to as the Pattisons building, but it was never actually theirs. They had offices on that site, but they were demolished, and then another company rebuilt this wonderfully extravagant building on the same spot, and that's still there, but that belonged to a different company. In the warehouse, what's interesting, if anybody has the Alfred Barnard's UK Distilleries book, Distilleries of the United Kingdom, there was an anniversary edition, and in that anniversary edition, at the back, you have the small sort of booklets that Barnard wrote for various different companies. There's one for John Walker, and he actually visited all of the Pattisons premises at the end of the 1890s, end of the 1880s, beginning of the 1890s. And so in that particular booklet and in the anniversary edition of the main book, you can see sketches of all of these buildings as they were when he visited, and also some photographs as well. They're not the best quality, obviously, but so you can see what they looked like then, and and they're still standing, so you can do a little bit of compare and contrast.
Okay, I don't have the anniversary edition. When did that come out? Just turn of the century for us?
Yes.
The 100th anniversary, I'm guessing? It's not 125, 150? I don't know. Which one?
I'm not entirely sure what the anniversary was, but it's a special anniversary edition. I can find out. It's kind of got a sort of brown kind of cover. And it's got all the booklets at the back, so I'm sure somebody, if anybody's watching, I'm sure they'll quickly type it in the chat.
They'll tell me that. Well, I'm always on the search for the books for obvious reasons, but I'm always on the search for whiskeys as well. So whiskeys and whiskey books, and you can't really tell, but it's whiskey paraphernalia up there as well. I don't know if you're a collector in that way, and where people will buy you things because they know that you're collecting this specific thing. So it's great to have 3 children, and they buy me things. Well, I'm easy to buy for. So Father's Day, birthday, Christmas, it's something, one of my passions at the moment. So I'll head them on to that, and one of my children will find that book for me. And it'll probably be an auction somewhere where you are, because our auctions are not the same quality for whiskey related paraphernalia as it would be for you. I don't think.
Is that right? Okay.
And well, going back to the Pattisons. I'm wondering what the average reader, or what you thought the average reader really knew about the Pattison whiskey affair before reading your book. So I was thinking what I did prior to reading your book and then after. And I'm thinking that most people would say, and I have kind of a list, that there were 2 brothers. I didn't know there were 4. I thought there were 2. So that was the first thing that I could see that I had mistaken. So that kind of brought me into the story. It's like, oh, what else did I not know? So that was the first one. We knew they manipulated the market. I think most people have that. We're thinking they were probably greedy, very sly type of individuals, both. I didn't make the differentiation that you're going to get in here with the 2 brothers. They probably got themselves into a bind that got worse as they tried to fix the problems, and that's what I had in mind. What was thought to be a rock-steady industry folded a bit too easily at that time. That's what I was thinking. And was there an impact behind the borders of Scotland? So is there anything else that you would consider common knowledge prior to doing your research? And is it just the modern whiskey lover who would know about the Pattisons in their time? Because I don't know if it's more of a common knowledge family where you are as opposed to me. And is there still remnants or influence in Leith? And we talked about that a little bit, but I'll see on the whiskey trail. But throughout Scotland or Great Britain, what's their influence, their legacy, I guess, beyond what you put in here?
Yeah, so some things that you've said about what people thought they knew about the Pattisons is actually spot on. Because and I think it would only be that list if you're a real genuine sort of whiskey enthusiast, because you would be reading about whiskey, and so the Pattison name inevitably crops up in any whiskey book that focuses on the sort of evolution of Scotch whiskey and the industry. It's pretty difficult to avoid talking about the Pattisons, and I think those key things are the things that are always talked about when referencing them. And I think that there's a reason for that, in that when all of this happened, there were lots of people who were involved with the Pattisons, and when it all went horribly wrong, these people wanted to distance themselves. So they had a certain agenda, and this narrative that was published after the business went bust, and certainly after the trial, this was repeated and repeated and repeated over the decades, to the point where everyone just accepted, well, that's the fact. That's how it happened. That's the truth. Nobody really questioned the fact that this might have been slightly biased from the outset. And so this is what we read in the various different textbooks that aren't necessarily focusing primarily on the Pattisons, mention of them and referencing them. So I think that's pretty much a concise list of what people would think, because that's all that's been available to read, I guess, in that sense. What was the second part that you said, Dolph? Sorry. Well, I'm getting old. My train of thought.
I'm going to go back into that. What did you know, or what were you kind of surprised learning? So my first surprise, like I said, was that it wasn't just 2 brothers, but an extended family, which you go into detail about later. But we'll talk about that. So what was your first surprise, I guess, when doing the massive amount of research that you have to do that?
I think that what I've just said, that there was this biased narrative that came out, and that actually nobody's ever questioned it until relatively recently. And so all of the years, I mean, it didn't really benefit people to question it. I think that was probably one of the reasons. Some of the big institutions and some of the big organizations, the big companies, maybe had this agenda, and that's when the narrative, which was designed to, as I say, for them to distance themselves from the Pattisons. That's when that was put out. So it wasn't really in anybody's best interests, if you wanted to continue working with these organizations, to possibly question it. And then so over time, nobody's questioned it until relatively recently. And I think that was a bit of a surprise to me, that it took such a long time for anybody to actually say, hang on a second, something's maybe not quite right here. So yeah, that was interesting, that everything pretty much said the same thing until very recently.
Until that. Okay. And the second part was the influence. Do they have an influence still, do you think?
The Pattisons themselves, as a business, as a company, no, but the lessons that we should be learning from the Pattisons.
We're not learning anything. No, but thank you.
But no, the lessons from history, what happened. I mean, I was just reading an article the other day written by Philippe Schreiberg, I'm not sure if I said his surname right, but it was in Forbes magazine. So he's written some amazing articles about the cask investors, and he basically posted, it's basically these people. There's a company that's gone bust, a cask investment company that's gone bust, and that, you know, they've been selling imaginary casks. They're selling casks at inflated prices, and they have been selling casks more than once, let's put it that way, which is exactly what happened in the 1890s. Not just with the Pattisons, may I add. The Pattisons were the ones who got caught, I guess. But you know, and nobody's learned from that. It's almost like this is an element of history. It's now repeating itself again. So I guess in that respect, the influence it continues.
All right. So it's relevant now just as much as it was then.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, more relevant because, yeah, nobody's really sort of taken heed of those warnings. But anyway.
And I laugh at the situation. I really shouldn't, because people are duped out of their money. But they want to have a part of what they think is a growing money-making scheme, and they're just jumping in so quickly. I'm always weary of trusting people that I don't know. And however, in this case, they all knew the Pattisons and they were still duped. So I probably would have been in that category where, oh no, they're good friends. I've known them forever. I knew the father. Take my money. Take it. Make money for me. Go take my money. So, but I have to say, before we really get into the meat of this book, I have to say that I'm really happy that you wrote it, for one, because Ian Buxton and Robert and Robinson, while we were on this, both talked about doing this book, but that it was relatively, when I said, why don't you? It was the research material that was cumbersome that they'd have to go through. And I was thinking in my mind that it's probably court documents and it's probably really boring. That's what was coming to mind when they were saying these things to me. But so I'll ask you, how much research in terms of time or pages read, because maybe it's tons of it, did you devote to this project?
Well, I mean, I started it essentially during COVID, during the lockdowns. And it was difficult at that time to have access to archives. You know, the National Records was closed. Couldn't go. So it took a wee while to get those, get access to all of those documents. I have actually no idea how many hours I have spent. I genuinely wouldn't even know where to start. But over the course of 4 years, off and on, plenty of time. But obviously, I had access to newspapers. So the British Newspaper Archive is online. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of research. I literally, anything I could find that had the Pattison name, no matter how small or how big, I read all of it. So that was the bulk of my research during during COVID,
Okay.
you can actually access the records physically getting into the building. But then once everything opened up, I was able to look at trial transcripts, witness testimonies,
Okay.
not just the witnesses that appeared at the trial, but also the witnesses that had been interviewed as part of the sort of pre-trial process, and read their bankruptcy documents, not just of the Pattisons, but of all of the other businesses that were affected. But by far the biggest, the most, not in quantity, but certainly by quality, was I managed to track down, oh, let me just close that, sorry. I managed to track down Walter Pattison's great-grandson. So I love family history, I love genealogy, so I was just, because there was nothing else to do during COVID, I thought I'll just trace the entire Pattison family tree. And there were lots and lots of dead ends. A lot of the families, so the siblings, some of them didn't marry, some of them didn't have children. Those that did eventually just hit a dead end. But there was one particular trail. Walter Pattison was married, he had a daughter. She had 2 children, and her daughter had a son, and it was him that I managed to trace. And his name appeared, it was just a name and an address that appeared on a death certificate. Okay. So I just sent a letter via snail mail and said, I'm super interested in the Pattisons. I'm thinking of writing a book. Would you have any information on them at all? And left my email address, and he generously got back in touch and said, yes, I've got all of the old photo albums and some of my great-grandfather's belongings, etc. So when the restrictions were lifted, I was able to go down there and have a look. And these photographs, in and of themselves, provided a huge amount of information. Some of the messages that were written on the back, some of the belongings, some of Walter's belongings led me down paths and provided this huge wealth of information. But what it did, more than anything that I could have found in any of the archives, was it made the Pattisons into real people. Suddenly, by holding Walter Pattison's wallet, by looking at a photograph that his wife had sent him with a little love message on the back, they suddenly became real people, which I don't think anyone's ever managed to sort of see them in that light before. Also, actual photographs of the brothers. Before, there had only been court sketches, and they just looked like total muppets in these sketches. And so you actually look at the photos of them, and they look, and you're like, wow, that's what they really look like. So yeah.
I'm going to put another quote, and you'll get used to me doing this.
Okay.
So the content of this book is based on true events, as reported in newspapers, trial papers, family documents, just like you just stated, that shaped and presented to reflect my own personal interpretation. That's page 5, people looking around. Why did you feel like you had to make this statement, that this is my interpretation of this? And then, actually, I'll stick with that for the first question.
I think because the approach to the book is maybe not what people were expecting. So to me, the Pattison story was that it's a story, and so it's a kind of narrative non-fiction piece, which I'm not sure people were expecting. And so I was worried that there might be some confusion when people were reading the book, that they thought, is this true? Is this? So it's all absolutely based on fact. Yeah, everything is based on fact. Anything in that book, anything from the bells of the church ringing to the weather, I can find you a source, a factual source where I've got that information. Okay. It was absolutely non-fiction. But I did think, even if you gave all of those bankruptcy documents, trial transcripts, etc., you gave those to 10 different people, they may interpret them slightly differently. So this is me saying, this is how I've read them, and this is how I've interpreted them. And somebody else, and I would welcome somebody else coming and say, actually, I think maybe you could read it that way, or some of it, it's not ambiguous at all, but there are elements which are. So that was that was kind of my cover my backside sort of quote.
But you're a teacher, and we're used to analyzing things. Are you fully engaged within the industry right now, or is this a passion project, kind of like me, and still have another full-time job?
No. So I mean, I run the festivals, and they take about 6 months to organize. I do writing for magazines. I'm on tasting panels. I've got my fingers in lots of wee pies, but I would still maintain, though, that the first book, especially a book that I've self-published, is most definitely a passion project. So the reason it took 4 years, over the course of 4 years, I wasn't writing every day, all day for 4 years, or researching, because always, if you're self-employed, the paid work has to come first, and so I would maintain that the first book is definitely a passion project from my part. But I think I've caught the bug. So I've already got 2 other books in my head. So hopefully it won't take me 4 years to get the next one out.
I love that. And that happened with David Stirk just recently too. He started writing, and then again and again. And if you've seen the books that he's come out with, he's prophetic in how much he's writing. So I'm hoping you get that same bug. Like a year and a half, maybe another year and a half.
Yeah. I've got some of David's books actually on the shelf in the other room. So yeah, I mean it's quite addictive. I mean, if you like doing the research in itself is very, very addictive, and then it's a little bit sad when the book is complete, because that's the end of the research. So then you think, oh, I'll write another one.
Well, and you have so much information coming across that and if you're in the industry, you see the links between this and these other things that you've been thinking about in the future, or in the past, not the future. Let's get back to this. Which sources contributed the most to your final copy of the book? Because I'm assuming that you had to bring it down, because if you have lots and lots of information and you write it initially, I don't know if it was originally 500, 700 pages, but to get it into the roughly 225 or 250 pages, what was the major source that ended up being your most important source at the end of this?
I would say the most important one, family documents, because again, it's sort of it's a little bit like a sort of quantity versus quality, I guess. The newspapers that formed sort of the base, really, yeah. And there was such a mountain of coverage in the press, especially during the trial, that covered a kind of base. It was kind of like the skeleton, really, but it was something like the family documents and the photos that put the flesh on the bones, if you see what I mean, and this was material that nobody had ever seen, because Walter Pattison's great-grandson had absolutely no idea what Walter had been up to. And he wasn't aware of the relevance of this, especially for, whiskey history geeks. So this was sort of new material.
You got to bring that to them too. And I don't know, maybe you have your own show where you do, well, they already have so many of the shows where you're doing the research into their past, but it'll be a whiskey past. And you bring them on the show, and this is your grandfather. Okay. Just a thought. Who knows? Then go on TV and just drink whiskey forever while talking to them. And by the way, I didn't say what I was drinking, because that came up with a friend, and that's the SMWS bottle I have today. It's a breakfast whiskey, and since I'm on with you, I'm allowed to start drinking at 11 o'clock. That's what my wife says. She said, "You're on. You can get away with it." Like,
otherwise I'd be drinking on my own. So, thank you.
Horrible. We spoke about this just a little bit beforehand, but the most difficult part of this book for me is keeping all the names straight. It really is. So there's a lot of repetition to given and family names. How did you keep them all straight? And what I told you I would have done was Post-it notes with all these lines. So I'm wondering what you did to keep it all straight in your mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of repetition of first names. So I think I counted 5, maybe 6 of the family were called Elizabeth. But they actually had pet names. So I didn't invent these pet names. So there was an Eliza and a Bessie and those sort of things. So I thought I'm going to stick to that, because then, we know which one we're talking about. I mean, some of the children died very young. So there was a Bessie Rose and a Bessie. You know, when Betty Rose died, the next daughter was just called Bessie. So therefore, you know, and there's a lot, you know, you can see how people get a little bit confused when they're doing the research, because, you know, sometimes the dates, they get all muddled up. It's actually quite confusing. So the only way that I could keep track of who was to create a family tree. So like 4 sheets of A4 all stuck together. I've got this big family tree. I mean, it looks a mess. It looks like the scribblings of a sort of insane woman, but it was a good way for me to double check every name and check every date. And then not just for the Pattisons, when I was looking at the link to the Sandersons. So William Sanderson, the founder of the company, his son was also called William Sanderson and took over the running of the company. And so it's exactly the same with the McKinleys, Charles McKinley. So it's just like keeping a track of all of these. I just created little family trees and highlighted the dates. Okay. The dates were the key to working out who was who and making sure I had the right information.
And at which time. Okay, well, good for you. You said you were a teacher, and some people think that teachers must have some innate ability with names, and I can tell you that I don't. My students know that, and they've come to adore that. That's what I tell myself. It's adorable. But I feel bad. But good for you. You were able to do that. Let's go back to what you were just speaking of as well, about humanizing Robert and Walter. So you enjoy researching the lives of the family. So I'm wondering, what about the roles of the extended family drew you to them? It's not just that they were related, but there must have been something that made you kind of grab on to what they were doing.
Well, you mentioned that there were 2 other brothers, and they did have some involvement in the business, and they were definitely in the whiskey trade, let's put it that way. Although I think the roles that they played within Pattison, Elder & Co, Pattisons Limited, were much lesser roles, let's put it that way. And one of them emigrated to the States. But it was, you know, another one, John, he actually, after the trial, tried to continue working in the whiskey industry with a business called Pattison and Co. And he set it up with his cousin. His cousin, incidentally, was in the house with John and Robert.
They came together.
Robert was arrested. So, you know, they're fully aware of everything that was going on, and obviously the business failed. But it's this kind of approach, really, that you know, they figured they were untouchable. But after the trial, the Pattison and Co business, it failed hugely, and he went into a completely different industry. So, you know, there were other brothers, they were involved in the business, but not to the same extent, obviously, as Robert and Walter. But the sisters are kind of overlooked, and the mother was, the impression I got from everything that I read is that the 2 brothers, Robert and Walter, loved their mother dearly and would do anything for her. She was a very sort of strong sort of matriarch, you know, kind of figure, and you know, that was one of the key arguments of the defense in the trial, was that their mother's income was linked to the business. So why on earth would they do anything to stop, you know, or decrease their mother's income? So yeah, that was a card that they played. But
I took that a little bit differently. Please don't put me in jail. My mother depends on me.
Well, and this is going back to what I was saying about different sources, you know, I mean, different people reading the same source, you could interpret it differently. But they had sisters as well. What was interesting is 3 of them never married, and they were kind of at marrying age when all of this happened. And I think that made them, you know, nobody would touch them with a barge pole, really. The Pattison name was dirt. So they remained unmarried. But 2 of the other sisters did get married, and
Laura and what was the other sister? Laura and
so Laura eventually got married, but there was there's a nice family tree in the back of the book. I'm going to try and find it. There we go. There's a very simplified one in the back of the book, which I tried to use. So I've got my glasses on. But you had Effie, or Euphemia. she was married, and then also Elizabeth, she was married, and it was, I think, Elizabeth that is mentioned in the book by Sir Robert Bruce Lockhart in his book on Scotch whisky. He mentions the Pattisons. He mentions a family based in the Speyside area, and yeah, I think it was Elizabeth that he was mentioning. But interesting. Interesting that they seem to disappear, and again they had different surnames, so they were able to maybe distance themselves from the whole Pattison thing.
Okay. And did you do that on purpose to humanize them? Because at the end, we'll get to this later, the involvement of the other people in banks. And were you trying to show a different side to them, even though you know that Walter, well, you showed that Walter was a bit aloof, but he was caring for his wife, and maybe that's why he wasn't paying as much attention, or he just trusted his brother implicitly. But you're humanizing him. You're giving him another angle for us to see. Was that the intent because you like the stories of the family and you wanted to mesh it all together?
Yeah, I mean, I think when as whiskey geeks we always say, "Oh, it's not just a drink. It's all about the people who meet, people who make it, the people behind it." And whenever you read about the Pattisons, they're just names. They're just this name, Pattison, in a whiskey book. Nobody really goes into them as to the type of people they were, and they were a huge family, and they looked out for each other, and in that sense, they were kind of just like every other family, But they've always, the name Pattison has only ever really been associated with the two brothers and not everyone else. And I've just felt that all of the others had their own wee stories to tell as well. That that didn't make the headlines, but they had their own stories, and Robert and Walter's story kind of overshadowed them, I guess, in that respect. But they all played a part to some extent.
I did like how you introduced the character and reintroduced the character for us. So people have a better memory than me. You would just give, you would say one or two lines or one or two words, and it would bring you back to who that person was supposed to be. So that gave me a hint. It was obviously intentional, but I'm wondering how much editing you had to do to make sure that we knew which Walter or whoever we're talking about at that point. So I'm wondering.
I mean, yeah, I did do quite a lot of editing, especially sort of right at the end when I felt that I had the final sort of manuscript ready to go, and then I took quite a lot of it out because it was becoming a little bit like those TV shows that you mentioned earlier, where people were tracing in their family. We've got one here called "Who Do You Think You Are," and it was becoming a little bit like that.
My wife makes me watch that. She'll watch things with me, hockey, and that's what I have to watch with her. Is that, and there's an American kind of same as that. I know it.
Yeah, and so a lot of that had to come out because it wasn't really whiskey related, and it didn't move the story along. I think it was, it was almost like a separate story in its own right. So there was a lot of, especially in the first chapter that I took out, but I kind of didn't write it as chapters. I kind of wrote it as threads. That's the only way I can describe it. So it's like if I would, because each one had their own story, I would kind of write the story. Let's say one of the other brothers, William Lang Pattison, I kind of focused on his story and kind of wrote that first of all. And then Laura had her own story, so I'd write that. And then once I'd got the timeline for each of those, I knew which section to put it in. And then I knew it would flow because I'd already written it kind of almost as a separate story. Yeah, there's so many layers. There's so many layers to it that that's the only way I could work out how to actually make sure it all flowed properly.
Well, intentional, very intentional, and you can tell you would have to, but with so many names. I'm going to read you a quote, which I don't have typed on the side, but this type of quote came up several times, and I'll read it first. So, this one's in reference to James Griggs, the accountant. So here's the quote. Many of the invoices were out of sequence, suggesting that not all of them had been recorded. He made a mental note to mention this anomaly with the brothers. So that's page 45 for those with us. So you're mentioning a mental note. Someone thought this, or they perceived this. And there's several where I was thinking, where did you get this information? And in my mind, it was the court documents. And I'm wondering if that's true. Is it primarily the court documents where you're thinking that's where he meant the mental note? Or did he actually say, I made a mental note of it?
So it's a really good point, because so I had never written. I think the last time I wrote a story, I was in primary school, actually a kid in primary school. So I read a book about how to write a book, and I read a fantastic book by a man called Jack Hart, and it's called Storycraft, and it tells you all about the narrative arc, etc. The examples that he uses, and I forget the name of the author, but it's a very well-known book. It's called The Devil in the White City, based in Chicago with the exhibition. And he criticizes the writer there a wee bit by saying, that's a piece of narrative nonfiction, and the writer states things like, he thought this, and he felt this, and Jack Hart's argument was, he could not possibly know, the writer could not possibly know that's how that individual was feeling or what he was thinking. So I did my best to take all of those references out, unless I could back it up in some way. So with James Gregg, he did appear as a witness at the trial, but he also, in the archives, there are also copies of his testimony pre-trial. And so in both of those, he does say, I made a mental note. So I was like, I can use that. Yeah. But there's lots of other instances where I think, in the book, certainly before I edited it for the first time, where I'd maybe got a little bit carried away with myself, and I wrote, he thought this and what have you. But if, as I said at the start, if I couldn't back it up with a sort of factual source, and by that I mean, we have to say, well, was James Gregg telling the truth when he said that? Well, I guess we have to. He was under oath, so we'll just have to assume he was. Then I felt that I could use it. But if I couldn't find anything to back it up, I didn't use it.
All right, good. Getting back to the family and the description of the family. So, and I'm really trying not to give too much away, because I want to talk about the book, but I want people to buy the book. So I'm going to pick certain parts out. And this is one I liked when you're trying to just the opulence. So here's actually this quote I have then. Boom. So within Seacliff's folly, rays of sunlight would catch the stained glass windows, not only producing a proud glow around the Pattison crest, but also animating the letters of the hallowed family motto, virtue non astutia, by excellence, not by cunning. And I found this really funny, as I believed when I originally read this, that Robert must have been cunning or valued cunning. I also looked to their crest with admiration, and I told you this when I sent you the notes, because my family motto is I meant well, and I absolutely hate it. Because I'm thinking the Shaws were so clumsy, so unlucky, so stupid in their dealings with everybody else in the world, that these words, I meant well, had to always follow an account of what happened. The king died. I meant well. I lost all the money for some reason. I meant well. So to the point, it's just so horrible. Do you have a family motto? I should ask.
No, we don't. Well, my dad was a Yorkshireman, and he didn't spend money too easily, to be honest. It didn't come easily to him. So we always used to say our family motto should be, because of him, should be something like short arms, deep pockets, or something like that.
At least that's funny, and it tells you something positive about the family, right? No, I meant well. Okay, sorry.
No, we don't have a family motto. But yeah. But this was interesting. Because this was another piece of research. I knew that the family had lived in Seacliff, and I knew that the property was still there, but I didn't have a contact, for a name for the person who lived there. So I just cycled around and put a little letter in there, through the letterbox sort of on the outside by the gate, and again just asked if they would get in touch. They were a bit reluctant to let me in because, as I say, it was during COVID and they didn't want some randoms walking around with whatever sort of plague or whatever. But they did send me photos of the inside, and so they have the photo of the stained glass window with the family crest, and there's photos you can see the light was shining in and how it was sort of lighting, and all sorts of belongings in there as well. And then part of the house had been converted over time, so where I guess the servants' quarters were, on the other side of the building, the people living there were quite happy for me to have a little look around. So I managed to see that part of the property. But yeah, absolute stunning building. But yeah, the Pattisons didn't own them. They were tenants. So these weren't assets in the liquidation. They didn't own them.
Buy the book so you can see the pictures, but there's also there's great pictures I liked, and one of them that I found very surprising that you had, this coming out of the the Glen Parkless houseboat. I
yes,
you would have gotten that, or maybe it was in a newspaper or something like that, which came out at the time. It's just so for those of you that like pictures with their books, like me, I like pictures, and it's not because I'm terribly simple, but I do like something that grabs the attention. Another quote. Imagine that. Here we go. So we've gotten into the description of the men, the family, the business, the history. First third of the book, essentially. Now we're getting into the second third of the book, where we're talking about their dealings, something more specific. So, and this is in 1895, Tuesday, the 11th of June. You say, when reviewing his stock and bond books, however, William Gentle noticed that his whiskey had already been recorded as sold to A.S. Murray Company, a Leith wine and spirits merchant, who had purchased the same 300 casks of Cameronbridge from them back in 1893. So this is page 33. I guess it's not the second part of the book, but I'm jumping back. Is this the first recorded instance where Robert started selling whiskey to more than one buyer? And do you believe that this could have been a mistake at that time? Because they talked later in the court dealings. Yeah, it was a mistake. It could happen. We sell so much. Of course, there's mistakes out there. Is this the first one you found? And do you think it could be?
It's not the first one I found, but it's going back to what you were saying earlier about repetition. There are lots of examples pretty much saying the same thing. And this was the one which was easier to follow as part of a thread going all the way through. So this was the first one that was of any real sort of consequence, let's put it that way. So so it certainly wasn't the first one. There were some slightly smaller amounts prior to that, but this was probably the first significant one, I think. And was it a mistake? My opinion, absolutely not. I don't think. I think it was very premeditated on Robert's part. He had a very clear strategy and knew he needed to make the company look worth more than it was in order to float it, and so this was kind of part of that strategy to do that. And I believe he knew exactly what he was doing.
It's important for me to establish this because you're doing the research. You have a link to the family now because you've delved into the family members. You've talked to the grandson or great grandson or great great grandson. So maybe you care about this family a bit more than someone like me, which thinks they're just crooks. So you're seeing beyond it a little bit. So I don't know. At one point, like the person who's been kidnapped, you're trying to find something good about the people to kind of explain certain things.
Yeah.
No, you're perfectly straight. You know.
Certainly, as far as Robert's concerned, he was most definitely. He was most definitely the leader of the two. And again, one of the arguments that Walter gave in his defense was that, when the balance sheets were being finalized at the end of the financial year, he wasn't there. So
taking care of his wife. Isn't he a lovely man? It was just,
This is maybe where the family documents and photographs come in, because he said he was away in Morocco. We don't have any, I didn't have any proof that he was, apart from him saying it. But then looking at the family photo albums, there's a whole album with about sort of 3-4 pages of photos of him and his wife in Morocco with dates. So he was telling the truth.
All right.
Yeah.
How ill was she at this point, where he's kind of he's not omnipresent whatsoever? It's his brother consolidating control, and William getting some information. How sick was she to bring him away, or is that just his personality?
Yeah, I don't think she was particularly ill. I think it was a kind of a Victorian thing where you would go to sunnier climes to benefit from the warmth, from the heat. I mean, she certainly outlived him, and in the photos, which are surprisingly clear, she doesn't look too ill. Let's put it that way.
Okay. She looks pretty happy, actually. Yeah.
So I think it was just what people of a certain part of society did. They went away during the winter time, the colder months in Scotland, and they went away to sort of sunnier climes, on account of their health. Was the key phrase that they used.
Okay, all right. And I was thinking about this possibly because when we look at the heads of gigantic whiskey alcohol companies, we generally see that it's the grandchildren who destroy it somehow. The children, there's the parent who worked very hard to establish. Usually the children sees how hard mom and dad work at something, and they have a good work ethic themselves. It's usually the grandchildren who sell it away for whatever reasons. And if you read any of Davin Kergamo's books about Canadian whiskey and our guys, you see that theme coming a lot. So I didn't know if that was kind of his personality or not, like a debutante that just wants to be taken care of and not working so much, or if he was really duped.
No, I think there was I think it was an element of both, really, because Robert didn't marry, and as far as I could find out, didn't have any children. Spent a lot of time with his unmarried sisters and was very close to the family in that respect. But I think because Walter was married and did have a child, he devoted a lot of time to them, and perhaps not as much time, wasn't too concerned about spending so much time working in the business as Robert was. I think for Robert it was the be all and end all for him, whereas for Walter it was his immediate family, his wife and child. And so there may have been a bit of a sort of laissez-faire kind of attitude, or Robert will just get on with it. But he does come across as having this more sort of domineering personality, and from everything that I've read, Walter trusted his brother implicitly, so just believed that what he was doing was the right thing and was happy to go along with it. Okay. If in the case, he did put up an amazing defense argument because he took the stand. Robert didn't. Robert didn't appear in court, not on that occasion, not for his trial.
And your description of Robert when they're in court and William's lawyer is making these points, he doesn't defend himself, really.
No. So Walter stood up in the dock, and he was questioned by both defense and prosecution. But Robert didn't. He wasn't. He didn't take the stand, and he wasn't questioned. He did appear in various other court trials. One in Inverness because of the bankruptcy of a business there, and he did have to, give a witness statement there and give his testimony. And then also the various sort of bankruptcy trials for him as an individual, the private bankruptcy cases. He did have to give evidence in his testimony then. But the actual trial in 1901, he didn't know. And maybe that's what worked in Walter's favor. I don't know.
Okay.
Could have gone that way.
And again, I want people to buy the book to get full view of how Robert skewed the records, the stocks, the payments, and this whole situation, really. But suffice it to say that you meticulously describe how Robert was able to advance a very believable perception of the family business in preparation before it becoming a limited company. So how did you take, so not that, how long did it take you to understand the process, that how he bought these things twice and how he sold it and how he manipulated his situation? And again, people should buy the book to find out specifically. But how long did it take you to wrap your head around it? Because I'm wondering if you had any banking, had any friends that are great, because my wife's a banker, so I put some of this to her, and she explained things very nicely for me, very simply for me. It was very good. But I'm wondering how you picked it up. Was it innate in when you're reading it, it just made sense, or did you have to go over it a couple times like I did?
I had to go over it more than a couple of times, because some of the terminology that's used was banking terminology, but it's also from, the 1890s that we don't use anymore. And some of these words have completely changed meaning, and it was working out the sort of vocabulary, first of all, that these accountants were using. And then I had lots of flow diagrams that I drew by hand, lots and lots and lots. And originally I was including all of the pounds, shillings and pence, and it was just becoming so convoluted. There is actually online a pounds, shillings and pence calculator, which was an absolute godsend for me, because I obviously have heard them, but I wasn't brought up, like, I only know metric measurements, and I don't know anything about pound, shilling and
I
pence.
had Siri beside me right away as I was explaining it to Siri to do the interpretation for me, because I was a little bit lost with that too. So.
Yeah, I ditched the shillings and pence immediately when I was writing the book. I thought, no, people don't need to. It stopped the flow of the story. Everyone, I don't know. So lots of flow diagrams, just trying to work out, where this money went, how it. I almost had something that resembled like cash books itself, where I had like money on one side, money on the other side, trying to replicate what the accountants were saying. And
I did that too, and it brought me back to my high school class of doing it. So the assets and the liabilities side, and I made notes to it. No, this is an asset. And I needed to do that. It's very helpful.
Yeah, no accounting background, and I mean, I've got GCSE maths, which I did when I was 16, and that's where it stopped. So, but it's just looking through it slowly, logically, methodically, and just trying to work it out. Yeah.
You put on your teacher hat and you learned. You learned it all while doing
That's
this.
it. Yeah, just
admirable. I love that. And also, so. Let's get this straight for people. You did the Leith Whisky Trail prior to this, so your knowledge of the whiskey industry was built there at that time, and you brought that into this book, and you gained more of a knowledge base within the whiskey industry from your research of the Leith Whisky Trail that you brought into this.
Yeah, I think it certainly helped me when I was doing the research, because I knew the names of all of these companies are familiar to me, and so that so I didn't have to look into the names as much. I knew which distilleries they'd acquired, etc., and had a sort of basic timeline for each of those companies. There were a few new ones that I hadn't heard of, and that's the beauty actually of, well, there are, I guess, people who self-proclaim themselves as whiskey experts, but I think the genuine experts would never actually call themselves that, and that's because they know that they're learning all the time. And with the Leith Whisky Trail, not that I'm professing to be an expert or anything, but with the Leith Whisky Trail, it's like there are always people who pick up bottles from the 60s or 50s with a name on, which has got Leith written on it, and they're like, oh, can you tell me about this bottler? And 9 times out of 10 I've heard of them, but there's always one, and I'm like, oh, that's new to me. So the beauty of the Leith Whisky Trail is that there's always something new to learn, there's, for me, and that's why it's kind of this evolving thing all of the time. But certainly my knowledge of who was who and where, and the geography of Leith and where the buildings were, helped me when I was putting this sort of landscape together of where the Pattisons were operating.
How much did friends possibly help you with this? Because I'm thinking, when I have a question now, I can email Dr. Nicholas Morgan or Billy Abbott. I can email them and text them, and they get back to me so quickly. They're beautiful people. I'm wondering, because you talked about an article with Nick I'm assuming you're friends and you get to know each other fairly well because you run in the same circle. So, were you able to use their knowledge somehow?
Well,
If I was writing a book, I would be pulling in everybody if I could.
So I mean, I've met Nick a few times, but as we mentioned before, I run the Fife Whisky Festival. I'm one of the co-directors of that, and we have an opening dinner on the Friday evening, and we also have a guest of honor. And so Nick was our guest of honor for one of the dinners, and I was sitting next to him, chatting away to him, showing him the photos of the Pattisons on my phone, etc., etc. And I did say to him that I had written this big section of one of the chapters about the Parrots. And I'd found 2 newspaper articles to kind of back that up. So I thought, okay, I'm going to include the Parrots. And then maybe about 3 days after I'd finished writing that, I read his article that had been published on the Whisky Exchange blog website, where he completely destroys the fact that these parrots could ever have existed. Now, I'm not one to argue with Dr. Nick Morgan, okay? So if he says they didn't exist, I'm like, okay, they didn't exist. But I was sitting next to him and I said, you do realize I've just written a whole chapter and now I don't know whether to keep it in there about these parrots or not. But I decided, because I did find 2 newspaper articles referring to these parrots, that I would keep it in. And I also thought, I mean, how can I write a book about the Pattisons and not mention the Parrots?
Well, I'm glad you did, because there's a possibility they did exist. And Nick does talk about how when they were bringing in the parrots, if there was, I think, 1,000 parrots, 2 would have survived, and they were used for the plumage more than actually talking points, literally talking points. But there's still the possibility that they did do this, and that there was at least one parrot somewhere at one point in time doing that. And I think it'd be fun. It's an image that I want to survive. So no matter what Nick says in there, I'm going to want the parrot to survive, and that's what happens with people in the whiskey industry. We care about the image. We want to think of the family-owned distillery and grandpa and son and grandson working the land and rolling the barrels and filling it themselves and not pressing buttons. That's not fun. So sometimes we don't want the truth.
Exactly. But it's in there, and then there's a little sort of bit at the back, and then people can make up their own minds about the Parrots. And I think that's something that I wanted to do as well. It's not going to not say too much, say enough to be able to obviously follow everything in the book, but I also wanted to put little things in there where people would, yes, the beauty of AI.
Pretty parrot. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's cool. I also wanted people to say, hang on, I haven't heard of that distillery, and not give so much information in, so that people could maybe make a wee note and then go and find out things for themselves afterwards. I kind of wanted to put a little bit of that into the book as well. Talking too much about where things are, etc., was just slowing the story down. So it was, again, getting that balance, giving people enough information so they feel that they're learning something, but also sort of triggering them to go and look into things a little bit more. So hopefully I've managed that.
Yeah, I think it was. Small little recap for people. You take us through the progression of Robert solidifying his position in the family business, becoming a limited company, expanding the business. We talk about the demonstrated opulence that we have for audacious to draw everybody into them, and then we start with the unwinding of it all. And people buy the book, but let's just say that you describe the step-by-step dismantling of the House of Cards, as well as the involvement of the banks and their roles, and the other whiskey business leaders at the time as well. So it's not just these two. There's other people that have an influence. And I'm not a lover of banks in any sense of the word, although my wife works for a lovely corporation. But let's leave it at that. How sorry did you feel for some of the smaller businesses that really didn't stand a chance when the Pattisons business folded? Because in my mind, they're the true victims, because the bank did get things back. and other people got some, but the little guy, nothing.
No, they got nothing. The banks didn't do too badly, to be fair, but then they never do they?
No, that's why they're banks, and they do very well.
But what I think goes back to what we were saying about humanizing them. I just wanted to give them their full names, so people actually had a name of this person, how they built their business up, how hard they'd worked, whether they were married, their age, whether they had children, because when it all went wrong for them, they still had mouths to feed, and they didn't have a penny. They didn't have anything coming from their own businesses going bust, and certainly nothing, especially the shareholders. That was one of the things. The shareholders got absolutely zero when Pattisons Limited went bust, and the creditors got some money, but not a huge amount. The banks were doing fine.
The accountants and the lawyers and the liquidators, they took their share as well.
Of course,
right?
Yes, yeah, yes. But I think one of the most interesting things, and I didn't include this in the book because, but I did find it quite interesting. Because obviously, as a company, Pattisons Limited declared a certain amount of money as profit, and it was overvalued. It was way more than it should have been. But based on that figure that they declared, they had to pay tax on that amount, and so one of the creditors at the creditors meeting said to the liquidators, well, if they've paid that amount of tax, but they didn't actually make that profit, they shouldn't have paid that amount of tax. They should have paid less. So how are we going to get that tax back?
Yeah.
And the liquidators were pretty much like, no chance. You have no chance at all. And so that made me laugh, because the tax guys, the government benefited from it to a certain degree as well. So
the arrogance of it all, though. I've done something really wrong, but this part of what I did wrong was right, and I want it back.
Yep. But the creditors obviously wanted to get as much money as they could. They weren't getting the full debt paid, so I guess they were sort of grasping at straws to that extent. But there were lots of people who did benefit, but the smaller businesses, the spirit merchants in up and down the country, not just in Leith, Inverness and Newcastle, and all over really. They went bust, and that was the end of it for them. And they had families to feed, and there was nothing in place for them. That was it. Done. Game over.
You do describe how they were brought in by Robert and kept on. And again, we're not going to talk about, because they can buy the book to figure. But yeah, I my heart did feel for them. But beyond that, I was angry at the banks a little bit. And let's stick with the philosophical view or question: should we think of the companies that abscond? Well, at auctions, they made money. So you talk about various auctions where nothing was sold, and then companies would wait. And finally, the companies like DCL, for example, would buy something really cheap. Do we think of these companies and the individuals, and it could be for anything. It could have been for the furniture, it could have been the horses, and all these things that you mentioned. Do we think of these people as vultures, or is it just business?
Just business, I think. The premise of any business is to make money, and that's exactly what they were doing. Just keeping the margins as high as they could. Some of the properties were bought. The huge bonded warehouses were bought by DCL for an absolute song, compared to what
how much product was in those. Sorry, that was another question I didn't get to. How much product was in the warehouses when they sold them to DCL? Did you have that information as well?
So when DCL purchased the bonded warehouses, it was just the physical building that the stocks were sold at various different auctions, and the stocks were immense because, as I say, they had all of these different bonded warehouses, but the ones that DCL bought, the Pattisons had, or Robert, should I say, had organized, the construction of that had started sort of 1897, and it wasn't really finished properly by the time the company went bust. So there were no stocks really in there, but any stocks that the Pattisons had, and that was one of the biggest concerns, was because they were so immense. They were worried that they were, going to flood the market. Because they were so immense, that's why people could pick them up cheap as chips, really.
So
Yeah.
we're not happy with the bankers, or I'm not. You're okay with the larger companies doing business. I'm thinking,
in the respect of like buying stuff at auction, I mean that was just the way it went. That's how the process. I mean,
however, you did want the sisters to keep those horses. You did. You wanted them to have that horse, right?
I really wanted them. I don't know if they did get away with it, but I hope they did.
See, there's the family. If it goes against, philosophically, I was mad at everybody that took part in the situation, and I'm okay. You drew me into the family because I didn't feel for the family whatsoever at the beginning. It's like, oh, poor family. Oh, poor thing. You had to move. Oh, poor thing. But you did introduce the family nicely to the point where I cared about their relationship, their role within all of this. So I thank you for that. And I would much rather they kept the horses than somebody else. However, if that somebody else bought them and they were hoodwinked by Robert, I would have wanted them to get it back, type thing. So there was a lot of feelings when you're reading this type of book about how society lets something like this happen and who lets it progress. And the bank's letting it progress because they're making money, right?
I think that's the key. It's one of the questions I'm asked so often is, how did the Pattisons get away with this for so long? And they did so because it was facilitated by other people. The banks, obviously, and Distillers Company Limited to a certain degree as well. I mean, the Pattisons weren't the only company operating in this way. In fact, the vast majority of the industry at the time was operating on credit in this way, and allowing the Pattisons to have so much credit wasn't just the remit of the banks. It was also Distillers Company Limited, Sanders, big companies were allowing them huge amounts of credit. So yeah, I mean, everyone was kind of operating in this way, and I guess the in that respect, the Pattisons were unlucky when the banks were like, we're not giving you any more money. It could have been anybody else, but it was maybe not anybody else, but it could have been a number of other people, number of other businesses, but it happened to be Pattisons, and that's kind of how they got caught.
I'm wondering if they made someone specific mad at something. They were in their social circles. Robert said something bad, and then I don't know, whoever, someone at this bank decided, I'm done with the Pattisons. I don't want to talk to them. We're not going to extend them any more credit. We're calling things in. And then that's how it happened. Or is it just, I don't know, it was
the situation of other companies kind of going bust, and one in particular, and it just made the banks a little on edge. And then they were like, okay, we're not going to give any more credit. So it could have been anybody at that point who had a debt that needed to be paid. It was just the timing wise, it was the Pattisons who needed the money and the banks who said no. Give it another few months, it could have been somebody else.
Okay. All right, so they're just unlucky.
Yeah, in that respect, at least.
So I'm going to have one question about the court case. Again, not so much information, but I think these 4 things are okay that I can talk about. So, and the court case taking 9 days. So day 1 to 9, May 8th to Monday the 8th of July to Wednesday the 17th of July, 1901. So there's roughly 50 pages. It was the quickest portion of the book for me because I didn't have to keep going back and forth anymore, I think, because I had it settled in my head. And we talk about the shady dealings that were reiterated in relation to the 4 different charges. And there's lots of good information, and it flowed they float. That's all I'm going to say. I didn't have to stop and go back and figure out who this was. So here's the 4 charges. So devising a fraudulent scheme to deceive the public into taking shares in Pattisons Limited. Mm-hmm. Number 2, embezzlement by appropriating £39,000 to themselves. 3, fabricating a false and fictitious profit and loss account and balance sheet for the year 1898. And it felt like that was the worst in everyone else's mind. That was the worst, but not for me. Defrauding the brewer Archibald Tower Errol of a significant sum of money. That was the one I hated the most. Was there one of these that you found more disturbing? So 4 was the most disturbing for me. And did the brothers' interactions surprise you?
So I mean, yeah. So I guess the charge against them regarding Archibald Errol was quite surprising, because he was a renowned brewer based in Alloa and considered to be a very savvy businessman, and even he got caught out, you see. So I guess that was quite surprising, that my knowledge of brewing history isn't great. So when I was looking into Errol, he was a very well-known man, and he was a great reputation in and around Alloa, and the fact that he could get caught meant that anybody could have got caught, really. So I think that was the most surprising. Sorry, what was the second bit, Dolph? I'm not very good. I did this with Mark Gillespie on Whiskey Cast. He asked me a question, I started answering, and halfway through I was like, what was the question again?
Was there one of these that you found more disturbing?
I would say
the last one was the most surprising. Was that the most disturbing as well for you?
I think all of them, because it's the sort of the fact that Robert was so gallous to think that he could get away. There's certain arrogance of thinking I can get away with this. I mean, 39,000 doesn't sound much in today's money, but it's like nearly 4 million. So yeah, it's like in today. So it's kind of like, yeah, the sheer sort of arrogance, the kind of brass neck. I think, yeah, the fact that all of them, he thought he would get away with it.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't feel all that bad for him, but a little bit, but not much. The little bit because there were other people doing the same thing. That's where the little bit comes in. My second question was, did the brothers' interactions between each other, especially when William's lawyer started asking very pointed questions, did that surprise you? Because I thought they were one. They would stick together no matter what, instead of, no, I wasn't part of that.
No, I think, and also at the end, I think Robert was, when I first started reading it, I thought, oh, Walter's throwing Robert under the bus here. But actually, I think Robert was fine with that. He wanted his brother to not serve a sentence, to be found not guilty. I don't think. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any animosity because of that. Having said that, there are literally no photos of Robert in the family photo albums. So there's nothing to do with Robert in all of the belongings.
That says
what his
something.
grandson has. So yeah.
Oh.
So, interesting.
Now I feel sorry for him in that respect. Like, he'll be remembered, buddy.
He seemed to remain close to his sister Laura, but it doesn't look as if he had anything to do with Walter after the trial. So yeah.
Or the brother that moved to California, who is that was the great grandfather of the individual you contacted?
No, so William was the one who moved to California, and so he was Robert and Walter's other brother.
Yeah.
So he would have been David. So Walter Pattison's great grandson, David. It would have been his great uncle, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, great uncle.
And the final one, again, I said the false fictitious profit loss, and you explain how he magnifies how much they have. So we magnify the stock that we have, and we diminish the amount that we owe to people. And so the difference between them. So let's say the stock goes up 2,000, you're not paying 2,000. There's a $4,000 difference, and they showed this on a bigger scale, and that seemed to be the biggest problem for the lawyers and the other individuals, was that situation. Whereas in my mind, I would have thought that maybe it would have been the link to the government, because it's a bonded warehouse. So selling something twice, or not having something and saying that you had it, having that link to the government and taxes, I thought would have been more heinous than making yourself or inflating the books to become a limited company.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was because obviously by inflating the profits, making the company look as if it was worth more than it was, it incentivized people not only to buy shares in the first place, but to keep their shares. So it duped a lot of people, a lot of members of the public. And so I think that's why the legal teams were maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. That's good. It's clarified a lot. And I have other questions as well, but read the book. Please. We've come to the end of the questions I kind of presented and sent out to you. Is there something that you would like to clarify that we did, or my questions didn't address, or something that we said that maybe I cut you off? Because I do that too. I just start talking.
That's good. It's good. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was saying earlier that I've got the bug for writing, and I think the next book that I'm going to work on has direct links to the Pattison case. So in sort of 1906 to 1908, there was the whole big case called What is Whisky, talking about, what can be called Scotch whisky. And, the most famous arguments come from Cambus and DCL, etc. Because and so that's something that I'm working on, and it kind of links to the Pattisons because of the makeup of some of their so-called Scotch whisky blends that perhaps weren't as Scotch whisky as we would like them to be.
Would the Scotch Whisky Association have a lot of information on that? Because they were, I believe, right there in that conversation. What should be a whiskey, what shouldn't be?
Yeah.
Or is it more of a money issue, those that wanted to become whiskey having their political influences? Yeah,
there's quite a few people that I can talk to about it, but certainly Scotch Whisky Association will be one of my first ports of call. But the truth, I think it's called The Truth About Whisky, or The Truths About Whisky, from the Irish distillers, is probably going to be one of the first things that I read.
Right.
So I think one of, we kind of touched on it with the whole cask investment schemes and things like that. But, the repercussions of the Pattisons, or at least what happened, you'd like to think that people would have learned the lessons from this, but they just seem to have been repeated and repeated. So, yeah, when you're reading about some of the cask investment shenanigans that's taking place at the moment, bear this in mind, because it's kind of not new. Yeah,
I've got that, and I'm looking forward to the book. My wife does have a question from very close by. She handed me the question, then went. My wife Laura, like the sister. So I always like seeing names of people that I already know. So I gotta say that. But my wife Laura was wondering about a screenplay. Wouldn't that be fun to have a screenplay, something like this? Because you've got the interest, you've got the family, you've got the opulence. It'd be beautiful, and then everyone likes it when someone who's built themselves up really high comes crashing down.
It's fantastic you said that, because I think Laura is the 7th person to say that to me. Yeah, I'm making a mental note. So lots of people think this would make a great screenplay. So if anybody wants to adapt it, that would be great to see the Pattisons on screen. But a lot of people, I think, have read it, and in their head they sort of pictured it as kind of like the whole scene is sort of evolving in their minds. So I think it would make a great screenplay. But
there you go. Who would you have in mind for the brothers? The two brothers. Sorry.
The two brothers. You can. I don't know, maybe Sam Hewen. He would be.
Okay.
I don't know whether I think he'd probably be more Robert than Walter, to be honest.
Dashing figure. Looking. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Who do you think would play Walter? That's a good question.
Someone who people trust and love, and they want to see him as what's his name? Sorry, he was in The Hobbit, and he was. Okay. My wife should be here because she knows I'm horrible with names when we're doing it. Left the question and took off. So the Bilbo Baggins is. She'll come down and tell me in a minute.
Okay, right. No,
so that's who I would have, because people love the character. They see him as a leader, but a little bit duped, but kind of goes along with the story. So Gandalf comes and he doesn't want to actually go, but he does, and he's duped into doing it. But then he does well for himself. So
there we go. Good.
My wife took a picture for me of him. So. Oh, well, my wife has yours, the Sam. So the Outlander. Yeah, he's a dashing figure, isn't he? He'd be good for Robert.
Yeah, I think so.
And well, my wife doesn't know.
We can dream.
We're just going to leave it with that. But if he does play the lead role for Robert, maybe get some money for that too. Not just because of the book, but because you're suggesting some things. I don't know. We'll make you more money no matter what. So everybody, buy the book. Any concluding comments on your side, ma'am?
No, it'd just be lovely to chat. I'm always happy to chat about the Pattisons or Leith or Scotch whisky history in general. So if anybody, wants to drop me a line, go onto the website. There's a contact form there. Any messages? I'm always happy to get messages and questions that people have. It just makes it more sort of interactive rather than me talking at people all the time. So yeah, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to answer.
Information up there. Right there. We'll do that. Well, that's all the time we have today, Whiskey brothers, sisters, and friends. And it's been a fantastic morning for me. And Walt turned into the afternoon just recently. Thanks to our listeners who joined us today, and mostly for those of you that join us in the future, because you haven't all read the book yet. So and I do suggest reading the book before watching this, but I have no control. Thank you very much. Again to you, Justine.
Thank you.
Here's the book, just so we can have the last picture. I hope you have as much fun as I did, because for me, I read the book, I get all these questions, and I get the information right from the author. Not too many people can do that, so I'm pretty happy. As a final note, if you don't want to miss a minute of any of these programs in the future, like, subscribe, but this is the important part. We're going to hold the glass up. Here's the good company, right here, good company. Here's the good whiskey, which is this one today. And here's the great conversation, and hopefully we see you all again sometime soon. Sláinte, and thank you very much, Justine. Have a great day.
Sláinte.
Yay.